This lesson, 10-3, is about complementary angles.
Two angles are complementary angles if the sum of their measures is 90 degrees.
So complementary angles are two angles that when you add their measurements together, you get 90 degrees.
Complementary angles that are adjacent form a right angle.
If you have two complementary angles that are adjacent, remember we learned that means side by side, they would make a right angle because together they make 90 degrees.
Angle AOB and angle BOC are complementary adjacent angles.
So these two angles, AOB and BOC, are complementary because they add to make 90, and they are adjacent because they are side by side. They share a vertex and they share this side OB.
Notice that as the measures of the two angles change, the sum of their measures is still 90 degrees. Suppose two complementary angles are not adjacent.
Complementary angles don't have to be adjacent. They don't have to be side by side because these two angles are still complementary. They still add to make 90. They just are no longer adjacent if we have them separated like this.
Even though angle AOB and angle BOC are not adjacent, the sum of their measures remains 90 degrees as the measures of the two angles change.
Okay, for our first example, our job is to draw or kind of sketch an adjacent complement for each angle. So it needs to be adjacent and it needs to be complementary. Meaning it needs to be side by side and it needs to make 90 degrees. So for this first one, we already have an 80-degree angle. If we're looking for a complement, we need another angle that would then sum to 90 degrees. Well, this one's 80. We need a 10-degree angle to make 90. So our second angle will be 10 degrees. Now we are also supposed to draw them adjacent. So they would share a vertex and share one of their sides. So we can almost just sketch in our 10-degree angle right here. And this measurement would be 10 degrees. So you can see that we get a right angle with these two. Since they're side by side, one's 80 and one's 10, that means that together they're 90 degrees. You can even mark it because these are making a right angle. Okay, you finish out the other two. Pause the video, see if you can draw the complementary adjacent angle that would go with each of the following. All right, so for B, we already have 30 degrees. We need a complement, so that would be 60 degrees to make 90. Together, if we draw them side by side here, that means that they would be adjacent, sharing a vertex, sharing a side. That would make them together make a larger right angle. All right, we have one that's 45 degrees. So in order to make 90 degrees, we would need another angle the same size. 45 degrees and 45 degrees make 90 degrees. And again, if we draw them side by side, which we like to call adjacent, and we draw the complement, which would make 90, then we're going to create a larger right angle. So I'm using the box to note that it is indeed a right angle. Name two angles that are not complementary. Pause the video, pick out a couple that you think would work, and then play the video. Okay, there's obviously several you could choose, but you need to choose two that would not make 90 degrees. So if I choose angle AFB and angle CFD, Each of these angles is 75 degrees, so they would not be considered complementary because when you add that together, you don't get 90. You actually get way more than you need. You would get 150. So these two angles are not complementary. There are some others that you could have picked, but this is a good example that would work. Your friend claims that all complementary angles must be acute angles. Is your friend right? Well, what do you think? Pause the video, maybe write something down, and then play the video to see how you did. Well, thinking about this, if you have complementary angles, that means you have two angles that when you add their measurements together, you get 90 degrees. Well, they must be acute. That means that they both must be less than 90. I think that's right. I mean, how could you add something together that was 90 or higher and get 90? I mean, if you're going to add two things together and get 90, these two things have to be less than 90. So a couple of acute angles would always make, a couple of acute angles would always make complementary angles. So your friend is right. Last part. We always like...
Nothing like an early morning stretch of the wings. The fresh sea air, the golden sunrise, and of course the map. Yep, the map. Take a look at this sunrise. Now you might see rays of light, but me, I see rays of angles. While you work on this problem, I'm going to do some angling of another kind.
Okay, we always like to try to do some math, some calculations with these angles that we're talking about. And we like to try to also use that algebra stuff that we spent so much time learning. Well, we're told in this example that angle 1 and angle 2 are complementary, meaning that they make 90 degrees when you add them together. You can see that in the picture because they do mark this with a right angle symbol. So angle 1 and angle 2 have to make 90. It tells us that the measure of angle 1 is 24 degrees. It can always be helpful to mark your picture with the information that you know. It also tells us that the measure of angle 2 is 3x. We have to find the value of x. Well, we know that these two angles added together must make 90 if they're complementary, which they are in this case. We use our algebra solving steps. 66. And we see that x equals 22. Last example. Pause the video, see if you can do it on your own, and then play the video to see if you did it correctly. Here we have an example of two complementary angles. They're complementary and they're adjacent. We know they're complementary because we see the right angle symbol. So we know these two angles add together to make 90 degrees. We also know they're adjacent because we see that they're sitting side by side. They share this vertex and they share this side. Well, we know that 47.6 plus x needs to make 90 degrees since they're complementary. So we can solve by doing the opposite of add and subtracting 47.6 from both sides. $42.4. Alright, that's it for this lesson. The big thing to remember is that complementary angles are angles that make 90 degrees. Sometimes we have complementary angles that are adjacent, like in this example, where they're side by side. And sometimes we have complementary angles that aren't adjacent, they're just complementary. They just both add to make 90.